Whose song is that? His favorite song? Anybody know?
Stand.
There you go.
How about yours?
And I never forget when Bob and Rosemary came for the first time to visit. Stan told me you need to have, you got to hear Rosemary's voice. She got a beautiful voice. So I dare to bet he was in heaven today, and he was listening and enjoying that as well. You know, we were. Has a beautiful one. It made me think of when she was singing it in my office. I have a plaque that basically says we have all eternity with which to enjoy heaven, but we only have one swift hour with which to earn what's left for us to taste. And I think it's important to think about it, what we're doing. As we look at the next study, I'm looking at you all know I love to study Bible characters. I love to study biographies even of people in our country or around the world. We just finished, obviously, Daring to be a Daniel. So I'd like to continue to do another one. And I think one question you can ask yourself, what do we mean by great? When we talk about great Bible characters or great people, how do you define great? And I think it's important. We're going to define it, not necessarily today, but won't we be thinking about how you would define it. Never forget Phil Jackson, the legendary coach in the NBA, made this statement about great. He said, good players become great players when they go from me to we. Now there's a lot of truth to that, but the trouble with it is that just means that's only on the court. How many of them can be we on the court but me off the court? So they're a great player, that doesn't mean they're great. And so I think about it, how are you going to define great when it comes to your Bible characters and for you and I? Because we are all can become great, but how are we going to define it? So I think it's important for us to think about it. Today I'm going to start in a series on Joseph, and I have hesitation to do so, and I'll tell you why. First of all, there's three reasons. One is the knowledge. All our life, how many of you have heard something about Joseph your whole life? I mean, from the time you're little bitty, so it's kind of like, what in the world can you tell me that I don't already know? So because of that, how many people say, all right, I don't need to attend church in the next however many weeks because I know it all? The second difficulty you have is that of vine. Do you realize there's more in the book of Genesis on Joseph than there is on Abraham? That there is on Adam, there is on Noah, there is on Isaac, there is on Jacob. A volume of information. So, again, you have that. I think the third difficulty you have is how many listeners have already made up their mind about Joseph. Different aspects. Really was hit on this last week. I was having some work done, and Brian was working on it, and a person came in, and one of our presidents was brought up. And immediately they go in and they were very negative. Their mind was made up and it was one aspect of the president that they were referring to, the one, very negative. It's amazing how many of our presidents in my lifetime, we can be negative on any one of them. We want to look at certain aspects, or we can be positive, some more than others, but there are different things. And so what happens is people do the same thing when they come to Joseph. They have one aspect they think about or whatever. Another reason is just because part of it is that it's my dad's favorite Bible character, and I hate to mess it up. Also, what's the purpose? Why would we study Joseph? In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 6 and then in verse 11, it makes the statement, talk about these things he's referring to in the Old Testament is for our example. So when we look at it, we look at pros and we look at cons, or what's taking place as far examples. Another reason is in Romans chapter 15. I want us to look at that one for a moment, and then we'll look at it. And this will be kind of an introductory one. We won't spend a great deal on Joseph, but I do want to look at some things. In Romans chapter 15, notice what he states in verse 4. Romans 15 and verse 4, he makes this statement. Whatever was written in earlier times, which obviously in the Old Testament, was written, notice first of all, for our what? Instruction. Then notice the second thing. Through perseverance and encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have what? Hope. So it's for our instruction, but we, just like with Joseph, we have to persevere. But it can be encouraging. Hey, Joseph made it, we can make it, and give us hope. So when we look at it, I want to be thinking about that while we're doing it. It's for not only knowledge, but then for instruction, but then also perseverance, encouragement, and hope. So think about it. The key verses most of us would know for the Joseph would be the last chapter in Genesis, chapter 50 and verse 20. Remember when his brothers come to him before they think after father had died? And remember they said in Joseph's response to him, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for what? Good. For good. Probably the key verse for Joseph's life, man of integrity and a man of forgiveness. You can break his life up in three different aspects, and also Scripture is the same way when you look at it. When you see it, you'll find that from age 1 to 17, basically goes from chapter 30 to 36. From 18 years of age to 30 years of age, it goes from 37 to 41, and then from 42 to 50 is his last 80 years of his life. But most of us don't think about those parts of it. We think about this one section. But for today, I want us to think mostly of his background. And the reason I say that is because if you want a title, it would be Dysfunctional Family. But I would have to say I think dysfunctional family is the norm and not the exception. I really do. And I think it can be true in almost every family. There's something dysfunctional in almost everybody's family, if we want to be honest about it. So when we think about it, dysfunctional, let me give you 5 aspects about it. Some are good, some are bad. But one of this dysfunctional part was deception. Let's think about it. We know the story as well. Abraham in chapter 20 of Genesis, what did he do with Abimelech? Is she your wife? And he said what? Nope, my sister. Well, what did Isaac do? 97 years later, she's not my wife, she's my sister. So what did Jacob and Rebekah do when it comes to the blessing from Isaac? Did they do a little deception and make him think that it was Esau? What happens with Laban? Did he do a little bit of a trick after Jacob had worked 7 years to get Rachel? Instead, he gets who? Leah. So then he has to work 7 more years. You get to chapter 39 and 41. It says he works 14 years for the ladies, 6 years for the flocks. And it said, Laban, you have changed my wages how many times? 10 times. Kind of some deception, wasn't it? Well, what about his mother? When they go to leave and the gods are missing, and she shouldn't have taken them to begin with because that's not the true God. She sits on them, and then when her dad's going, remember, her husband said, whoever you find, you can kill them. And then when it comes to her, she's sitting on, it's on time of the month, I can't get up, sorry. Lie, deception. You know, what about the brothers in chapter 34, his older brothers? And they tell the men of Shechem, oh yeah, we'll intermarry with you, but we just need to, you aren't circumcised. So then when they're circumcision, they then go in and kill them. Deception. So would you agree that family trait was deception? It's been going on for a long time. Although when you get to Joseph's life, how many times do we find deception in his? So I think a question you can ask is, obviously with the dysfunctional family, the deception was certainly the one that they had. What family traits do you and I have? How many of us are being honest and really look at the good ones and look at the bad ones? Or I remember one of my sisters, and she doesn't agree with it today, but I'll never forget just talking to her, and I said something, she goes, that's just the way I am. Well, you know, that may be the way we are, but it doesn't mean that's the way we have to be. God can change. And so I think we can't blame it on our family history. Those are our traits that we can have to address. And sometimes we'll have traits that our parents don't have. I know one trait that, I have always been more of a pessimist, negative side. My parents aren't that way. And so I've noticed that my son has been that way, and it's something I've had to try to address and try to get better at. So there can be traits that you have that don't even relate, which you can have. So think about it. When it comes to deception, what are my family traits, and what am I going to do about it? Usually we say, that's just who I am, accept me. Well, we need to try to say, if there's something we need to change, let's change it. The second problem you have in this family is what I call dysfunctional roles. Dysfunctional roles. If you remember, he starts off with how many wives? Okay, well, it's no fault of his own in one aspect. He has 2 wives, okay? In chapter 29 through chapter 30, you remember Leah starts having children and giving him sons, and Rachel cannot. So what does Rachel do? She gives him a handmaid. Well, did he notice he didn't have to accept it? So then they started having children through the handmaid. And then Leah stops giving birth to children. So what does she do? Gives her handmaid. I mean, nobody put a gun to any of them to say to do it, and nobody said they had to take it. The roles are messed up. And then so you think about it, what's happening in that family. You have 4 women in the family, and you have, you can see all the jealousy and the strife that would go on. I don't care if it was 1 woman and 5 men, or it was 1 woman or 1 guy and 5 women. You're going to have trouble. The roles are messed up. You also have it with the roles, when you look at it, talking about dysfunctional roles, when they meet Esau. If you remember, Esau's coming to the meeting, and he's coming back, and he has 400 men, and Jacob is scared. Do you ever see how what he did to go meet him? Who should have been at the head of the pack to meet him? He should have. Instead, what did he do?
Put the women first.
But which women did he put first? The handmaidens and their children were first, and then Leah and her children, and then Rachel and Joseph. His roles are messed up. They're family roles. But even in our life too, our roles can be messed up. But again, are all roles the same in every family? And so I think there's some things will be, but there are other things won't be. But how many times do we try to tell other people how they need to run their family based on how we run ours? There's certain things biblically that, yes, you certainly can, but there's other things that we have to recognize. So think about it. How well do I accept my role? I can't change somebody else's role, but how well do I accept mine? So and how well do I define mine? I think it's one of the things that you have very early in marriage. It's one of the things when I counsel with people, which I don't do marriages often, but when I do, what do you believe the roles are going to be? Because they each come from a different family setting, and each one has a different definition of what they think the other one should be doing. And one of them thinks that I'll be doing this, and one of them, you should do the dishes. No, I shouldn't. I'll do whatever I might do. So think about it. Dysfunctional, the roles were there. The third one I can think you can see it was that of dissatisfaction. Was Rachel dissatisfied that she wasn't having children? Was Leah dissatisfied that she stopped giving children? And you think about it, when God did open the womb and give her Joseph, what was her direct quote? Do you remember in chapter 30 in verse 24? It's interesting. Look at it. It could be a play on words, but chapter 30 in verse 24, she said, and she named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give you another son. Was she satisfied with one? Did she want another one? How many of us, when God gives us one thing, it's not enough. We want more. It's amazing when you look at it, dissatisfaction is certainly prevalent too. So not only is it deception, not only dysfunctional roles, not only dissatisfaction, what about discipline? Did they have any problem with discipline in the home? If you remember in chapter 34 with Shechem, you remember when the head of Shechem's son wants Diana, and so he rapes her. And Jacob comes and hears about it, but his sons are all off with the livestock, so he keeps quiet. I can't address it in his mind on my own. But when the sons come back, what does he do? He doesn't do anything. That's why Simeon and Levi, and that's why they go and they kill all of them, through deception. But the discipline aspect, he didn't do it. What happens with Reuben, when he goes to bed with his with Rachel's maid, his father's wife. Jacob never addresses it until he's dying in bed when he goes to give the blessing. He never addresses it. He knows it, but he doesn't address it. And so sometimes I think discipline too can be a problem in the home. But before we get too critical, how many of us have problems that we see but don't address? How many of us have problems we see but we wait too long to address? You know, when you have an animal and something messes up, do you wait 2 days before you do it? Is the animal going to even know what's going on? No. It's amazing. Or how many of us let others do it for us? You know, it's you ever had a student that you just was really messing up or whatever, and well, I'll just let the administration handle it, or I'll let parents handle it, or whatever it might be. So think about it. Do I address problems when I see it? How many of us, all of us are in places where there's problems. If you're work with people, there's problems. But how many of us just put our head in the sand and forget about it? But the fourth one I want to look at, I think quite often we forget about. We see all these negative things, but I think there's also positive things that it was in his family history too. And that is of deity. They also did worship the Lord and serve him. Talk about his family. So look over in chapter 30. It talks about with Rachel when she has Joseph. Notice in verse 22 it says, God remembered Rachel and God gave heed to what? Her. Does that mean she's praying? She's been praying. How long has she been praying and how long has she been asking for a child? So that's notice then she also gives God the praise when she even goes on. She recognizes it. So that's part of the family history too, when you think about it. Another one, you go over to the next chapter, what about chapter 31, you find with his father, and Jacob does it on several occasions, but starting in verse 5, and then also in verse 9, if you notice they're going to be leaving, separating from Laban, and notice you have it, goes up in verse 3, the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers to your relatives, and I'll be with you. Does he have a relationship with the God? Verse 5, he said to them, talking about to his two wives, I see your father's attitude that is not friendly toward me as formerly, but the God of my fathers has been with him. Does he recognize God's been with him? And he worked hard. You look earlier and he talks about how he was cold, he was wet, doing all the stuff with the sheep, but he recognizes God's blessing. You go a little bit further, notice down in verse 7, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages often, 10 times. However, God did not allow him to hurt me. Does he recognize God in his life? Quite often we don't recognize this part of Jacob and Joseph's history. We recognize the dysfunctional parts, but he also had good parts. Because how long was Joseph in the home before he was gone? And I think it's important to recognize there are some things they did that were good as well. You go down, what about, you get a little bit further, what about verse 15 and 16? It's interesting. Are we not recognized, remember he's talking to Rachel and Leah, you find that in verse 14, so they're speaking back to Jacob. Are we not reckoned by him, talking about their father, as foreigners? For he has sold us and has also entirely consumed our purchase price. Surely all the wealth which God has taken away from our father belongs to us and our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to do. Okay? So in the family, when Jacob's saying we need to move, God's telling me to move, and notice he's telling the wives this, and the wives saying we recognize it, and you need to do what God has told you to do. Again, those are things we have to remember in Joseph's family history, or what they're talking about. They are worshiping the true God. Yes, they had problems in their home, but they do recognize God. They do recognize he's sovereign. They recognize him as their Savior. They recognize him that they're servants too. He's in charge. We're the servant. Go down to chapter 32. Remember when they go to meet, and they go to meet Esau. Starting in verse 9, we know when wrestles too. Jacob, notice he says in verse 9, O God, my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who just said to me, return to your country and to your relatives, and I will prosper you. I am unworthy of all the loving kindness and of all the faithfulness which thou hast shown to thy servant. For with my staff only I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mothers with the children. For thou didst say, I will surely prosper you, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for the multitude. So notice, does he believe? You look at those different parts. He remembers God's promise, right? He also recognizes his place. He's unworthy. He petitions God, and then he also reminds God of his promise. You told me, sand of the sea. If Esau comes and kills everybody, then what happens to the promise? So I think it's important to recognize we see the bad parts of this dysfunctional family, but we need to be fair also and see the good parts. And they are worshiping Him. And so for every one of us in our families, there's things that are good, there's things that are bad that we can address. But let's forget, he also has talking about Joseph's history in his family about deity and the parts of God and to talking to him in prayer and everything else. Joseph's going to do that later, but he also had a mother and a father that did it. So I think it's important. So let's think about it just in the closing part of this dysfunctional family, just on the introductory part. But when you think about the parts, what family traits do I have? Good, bad, whatever it might be. And what changes do I need to make? Is anyone too old to change? It's up to them to change them. The second one comes to our roles. What role do I have, and what roles, and how well am I fulfilling? If we never really look at them, we never really will address them. On the dissatisfaction, how many of us are satisfied where God has you? I think it's important because in Philippians 4, remember Paul says, I've learned to be content. How many of us are satisfied with what God's given us? Or how many of us always want one more thing? I don't like the car. I don't like the house. I don't like this. We're always dissatisfied. If you're dissatisfied, that is a place for the Satan to get into and can really mess your family up. What about discipline? Do I address problems or do I just ignore them? When you ignore them, other things happen. Jacob had addressed it. And by the way, he doesn't get on his sons. He gets mad because he says what? If you look at the text, he's afraid that Shechem people are then going to come back and the surrounding people are then going to come after Jacob. He doesn't say what I did was wrong by not addressing it. Now what about the part on the deity? Do I have a personal walk with the Lord? Did my family see the personal walk? And are they included in my personal walk? It's amazing, there's only one question in all the Gospels that the disciples ever asked Jesus to teach them. Only one time did they ever ask Jesus, teach us something. What was it?
Pray.
Why would they ask Jesus how to teach us? They didn't ask us, teach us how to make a living. Didn't ask him to teach us how to do this. Because they saw the importance of prayer in Christ's life and the results they wanted it. Do our families see the importance of our walk with the Lord, that they want that? Because we all have faults in our life, but do they see that walk that I have and they want it? That's a question. But if we don't live it out before them, and if we only do it in the privacy of our bedroom, how are they going to know that's even vital in your life? If you don't talk about it, and if they don't see it, and if they don't see it, and if they don't see it.